Welcome, everybody, to this webinar that's put on by New Lines Institute and Mantis Analytics, which will be covering the geopolitical forecasting platform that we've recently launched, and in particular, focusing on the simulations component of the platform. So I'll be joined by a couple of my colleagues here today, but just to give you guys an idea of what we'll be covering in today's webinar. First of all, we'll discuss the functional impact of geopolitics. So we're always looking at kind of applying geopolitics in a very practical way, whether from a business standpoint, a policy standpoint, academic standpoint, etc. So we're always looking at those functional impacts and how geopolitics matters to various audiences. That will kind of get us into the geopolitical forecasting platform that we've recently launched, as I mentioned, between New Lines and Mantis Analytics, and then really focusing on the importance of geopolitical simulations, why they're necessary in today's very dynamic environment, how we utilize the different technology tools and the analytical methodology from both organizations. We'll go over some examples and some results from recent simulations that we've done on a couple of geopolitical hotspots, including US, China, Taiwan, as well as Middle East, and looking at both from a policy and business impact standpoint and how some of our simulations on both the human level and the AI level compare to each other. And then finally, we'll round out in terms of kind of updating things on the administrative front, the process to become an early adopter for our geopolitical forecasting platform, as well as to actually participate in our simulations, some upcoming events that we have, and of course, we'll round out with a Q&A from the audience. So very briefly, I'll just kind of start off by showing, as I mentioned, geopolitical events have increasingly had an impact not only on business, but all kind of organizational and functional impacts. And we've seen this really intensify, over the past 25 years or so. So going back to, the start of the 2000s, obviously we had the 9/11 attacks, in 2001, and kind of in the same year, China joining the World Trade Organization, which obviously is an economic move, but that has had significant geopolitical implications. And then kind of running through, between then and now, we had everything from the global financial crisis in 2008, the shale and fracking boom in the US in 2009, Arab Spring, the start of the Russia-Ukraine conflict back in 2014, Brexit in 2016, COVID in 2020, obviously the trade war between the US and China starting really in earnest in 2018, the intensification of the Russia-Ukraine conflict in 2022, the Gaza war that started in 2023, and most recently the US presidential elections at the end of last year. So all of these have had significant and arguably increasing impacts from these geopolitical events on all of our day-to-day operations. Now, this recent current risk landscape survey, essentially from the World Economic Forum, I think very much reflects this in terms of what are the major global risks that are reported, from various organizations, businesses, et cetera. And as you can see, two out of the top three are very much geopolitical in nature. So whether you're talking about state-based armed conflict, geoeconomic confrontation, such as what we've been seeing between the US and China, but even some of these others like misinformation, disinformation, polarization, and arguably even extreme weather events have some geopolitical influence or at the very least geopolitical impact. So obviously from a geopolitical standpoint, that risk landscape is becoming increasingly felt. Now, interestingly, though, if you're looking from a corporate standpoint, we've seen that, that corporate attention to geopolitics was on the rise, especially around that 2022 period. This obviously coincides with the start of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, or at least Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But it's been actually trending downwards somewhat before starting to tick up again in 2024. So as we've seen this global political risk or geopolitical risk rising, the attention, whether it's corporate, whether it's, in other fields, hasn't quite matched that uptick in the impact of geopolitics. And here's another slide here, just looking at what CEOs have been talking about, recently. So you can see everything from trade policy, supply chain, tariffs, AI, economic elements like recession, again, all of these, if not directly, but certainly indirectly, are very much impacted by geopolitics. So clearly, when you're looking at things like operational, functional impacts, it's very important to understand geopolitical trend lines. And as we will be focusing on in just a moment, a forward-looking forecasting and scenario building component of those trend lines as well. So, but with all of this, there is a problem that I think has clearly emerged, which is that there's a lot of information out there, but it's very difficult to understand what's important and what's not, what's going to impact your organization, your business, and what's just kind of a, a headline that's, amongst many others. And so we've seen that there's a data overload and signal to noise problem in which we have assessed that 80% of data isn't analyzed or operationalized effectively. At the same time, that geopolitical instability, is at the forefront. So we've seen that 75% of companies have reported not only just broad impacts of geopolitical developments, but also direct supply chain disruptions. And at the same time, we're seeing that hybrid threats are, whether that's coming from, cyber activity, sanctions, trade restrictions, are having a very kind of direct and functional impact on companies and organizations, with 4.35 million being the average cost per hybrid supply chain incident. So this is kind of sets the stage for our geopolitical forecasting platform. And I should note that this is our second webinar that we've held in this format, and we're happy to kind of include the link to our first webinar, which really explored this platform and all of its core features, but we'll certainly reiterate a lot of those this morning. But basically, this platform is one that is a product of a partnership between New Lines Institute, which is a nonpartisan foreign policy think tank based in Washington, D.C., and Mantis Analytics, which is an AI and tech startup. And we've got representatives here from both companies and both organizations that we have partnered together to launch an AI-powered platform to help not only monitor and assess, but also forecast geopolitical trends and simulate their impacts. So this platform, and it's got a number of different accompanying services, is designed for various stakeholders, including industries, government, universities, and civil society, all of which have the goal to mitigate risk and basically strengthen their decision making across, this rising political, economic, and security uncertainty. And so the platform is basically designed to demonstrate and to really visualize how geopolitical shocks can cascade, and offers a structured environment for testing resilience and the readiness of your decision making and your contingency planning, again, whether that's from a policy perspective or a business perspective. Now, just to kind of a few brief notes on the importance of simulations in particular. So, as I mentioned, we're living in an increasingly dynamic and as well as interconnected world. What happens locally oftentimes spreads into various regional and even global implications. So it's really important to not only understand the geopolitical trend lines that are currently happening, but also to anticipate them. And this is, a core part of the work that we do here at New Lines, which is, forecasting and scenario building around various geopolitical hotspots, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, Middle East, US, China. We look at on a country level as well, and on a global thematic level on things like trade, technology, and energy. And so we found that conducting geopolitical simulations and basically playing out in real time hypothetical future scenarios in an interactive way is really vital to deepen your understanding of the high level political, economic, and security dynamics of those geopolitical hotspots that I mentioned, and no less importantly, their global implications. And then we found that utilizing the unique geopolitical forecasting methodology developed by New Lines and the technology and AI-driven tools of Mantis Analytics, simulations are developed to help understand and predict the strategic decision-making process of those stakeholders that I mentioned. And one last point that I'll just briefly touch on is that, we like to think about our geopolitical simulations as not just being war games where there's a lot of war games that are done at various think tanks and even at the government level where you're exploring, the military dynamics, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, for example. What we really do is we explore the intersection of various core geopolitical elements, including diplomacy, but also economic statecraft, things like trade restrictions, sanctions, actual, cutting off of various trade flows, or at least the manipulation of them. And of course, yes, there is a security and military dynamic that you can't ignore with a lot of these hotspots. But really, the focus is on the real world implications for both state actors as well as non-state actors like businesses. And I'll just kind of round out here by briefly touching on the methodology that we use at New Lines in order to do our strategic analysis and forecasting. So this is kind of a very high level framework that we employ that consists of kind of multiple, pretty straightforward steps. So number one is to basically establish the scope of what you're forecasting. So pretty simple. You start with a topic, you start with a question and a time frame, right? So, and we can do this, like I said, on a country level, on an international level, and even on a global thematic level. So as an example, you can say, what is the outlook for the political environment in the US for Q4 2025. You can look at, a little bit broader out. What is the outlook for US-China tensions over Taiwan in 2026, for example? Or you can even kind of go, much more broad. What is the outlook for the global climate transition, for example, over the next 10 years? So we are constantly working to forecast against these different topics and timeframes. From there, you can identify who are the key actors, and this is both state actors and non-state actors, and conduct strategic analysis, which we sort of interpret in a very literal way as analyzing the strategy and decision making of those actors. And we utilize a lot of different analytical methodologies, from geopolitical analysis to human agency analysis to connectivity analysis, in order to really understand who those actors are, what makes them tick, and put ourselves in the shoes of those players. And then is where you actually incorporate the key indicators and data inputs. And these can, this is everything from quantitative to qualitative inputs, from open source monitoring to statistical databases to our global network of contacts throughout the world. And that basically allows you to, collect and analyze those data inputs with an understanding of the strategic analysis of those actors. Next, we can produce a net assessment, which we basically interpret as the current status from a high level perspective, both broadly geopolitical, but also political, economic, and security, standpoints of those various topics. And that is basically the last stage before you get into the forecasting and scenario building process, where we can design scenarios. We look at things like drivers behind different scenarios, like military escalation in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, like political destabilization on a country level, or on the disruption or enhancement on global themes like trade. So you can build out those scenarios looking at things like drivers, signposts, arresters, and most importantly, the implications, and risk levels of those various things. And once you have an understanding of those scenarios, then it's a regular, unending process of analyzing the data inputs that we're collecting against both the current situation or the net assessment and the future, potential outlook in terms of the forecast scenarios. So with that, I'll hand this over to my colleague Maxime from Mantis Analytics to talk about the AI and tech methodology and architecture that we use for the platform and for the simulations.
Yeah, thanks, Evgen. So my name is Maxim, and I'm CEO of Mantis Analytics. And today I want to bring some technology perspective, right? Because I don't think we can manage modern geopolitical complexity only just a methodology. It's only combination of proper methodology and technology, especially AI. So first of all, let me explain high level architecture that we use for simulation perspective. Like first of all, we collect data, right, from different data sources, from open source, from social media and web, just to understand some kind of past perspective of the geopolitical incidents that happened in some last period. But what is important is that we really tailor this stream of incidents for specific simulation and specific context of the simulation. And as a core of our platform, we have agentic framework. With the help of that, we can automate the simulation process. and presentation layer, so we can visually show results of the simulation. And also, I think it's very important to have some kind of collaboration aspect, because in a specific simulation, we can have like hundreds of participants which are globally distributed. So next slide, please. To effectively implement like a simulation, like first of all, as I say, we need to have some kind of awareness, right? What's kind of geopolitical risks and like any other kind of data, for example, trade flows, impact of the sanctions of the trade flows, and so on. We have, and we need to effectively analyze, right? So the next step, it's using AI for contextual evaluation of these incidents, right? What is really important for specific context of simulation? What is really important for specific organization and strategic like objectives of this organization? And AI help really categorize these incidents. And next step, it's using AI specifically for what-if analysis. So using AI for simulation like help us to make like very serious like shift from reactive approach to proactive one, because we can effectively test different kind of scenarios and prepare some kind of proper scenarios how what should we do in these scenarios. And with AI, I think now it's much easier to do like compared with like several years before. And the strategic goal, and I think like most of the organization will came to that in a few years, it's like a decision intelligence. So I really believe that most of the AI critical decisions in a few years will be AI assisted, right? It will be not like pure human decisions, right? But to do that, especially in some kind of complex areas like a supply chain and geopolitical disruptions and so on, we need to start this digital transformation now to be prepared beforehand. Next slide. And so definitely about this like evaluation, we can organize like separate webinar, but I want to like highlight that there are like several stages, right? Several levels how we can use AI specifically for simulation perspective, right? And the simplest way we can use like LLM models like ChatGPT and so on to run like very simple simulation. Now it's absolutely like possible, right? There is no limits and no barriers for that. But to make it these simulations like more effective, as I understand, we need to add like specific context. We need to add very tailored data sources. We need to add data which is really important for this simulation, because you know like that for some publicly available LLM models, the data coverage is very limited and based on the specific like websites. But for simulations, we need to provide like really customized data. And also, if it's like corporate aspect, we need to provide some internal data of the company. And the next stage of that is implementing like multi-agent architecture, which is really focusing on specific domain, right? Because we need to train these agents for the domain expertise, and that's how we can came to the some kind of simulation layer, which is fully tailored and customized for specific like organizational needs. And as I say, my prediction is that in a few years, most of the organizations will have such in some kind of level, they will have this like simulation layer inside the organization, right? And our strategic goal, it's a real-time adaptive intelligence, as I say, like integration of AI in every like decision making in the company, specifically for critical mission decisions, because AI definitely can bring additional perspective. AI can analyze like much more data points in time and so on. And so in this case, and like just to just to repeat that, I believe that AI will participate in most of the critical decisions in few years. Next slide. Okay, and a few words about like specifically of usage Mantis analytics platform for simulation perspective. As I say, first important action that users can do like before the simulation, during the simulation, it's just monitoring of incidents on the different levels, on the geopolitical level, on more operational level. But first of all, we need to just to be aware, right, what's happened in some period of time, in just to prepare for the context of simulation. And also, like, very important that the stream of incidents we really tailor for the simulation context. So in this case, it's such kind of monitoring is really focused on the simulation perspective and simulation context. So next slide. Also, I think from the simulations that we already did, we understand that it's a complex exercise because we have a lot of data points, a lot of actors, and a lot of like different strategic objectives of these factors and so on. And it's very important to have visual component, right, to visually show the data, impact of decisions, impact of the geopolitical incidents, for example, for global trade flow, impact of the sanctions of the trade flow. So in this case, in the platform, we do like very clear like visualization of important data points, and we show like important focus, right, which can help analysts to effectively do the simulation exercise. Next slide. Yeah, and next, the most important part, it's first of all like a generation of the scenarios, and already Evgen explains the methodology how to do that. But in the platform, we effectively visualize such kind of scenarios like geographically in a stream of such kind of incidents and so on and so on, and that's help like participants of the simulations like visually understand the information and take the right decisions. The next slide. And also specifically in the platform, we integrate action plans, right? Action plans, decisions which actors can take, and that we visualize in the platform. And now we can launch that in the two parallel way, using like human involvement, like subject matter experts, or like any kind of top managers, for example, from the specific company. And in parallel, we launch that using AI. So in this case, there are like different perspective how to use AI in the simulation. For example, it can be AI version of the decisions, right? That's the first way. The second way, it's a AI evaluation of human decisions, right? That we also can do. So it's interesting. So now we are living in time of the combination of human expertise and AI expertise, and you see that we can combine that in different angles, which are really interesting. And the next slide. And the next very important point, it's some kind of evaluation of these decisions. Evaluation of these decisions from different perspectives, from impact of key areas to the company, of organizations, or national security, and so on and so on. And so for that, we are developing a specific like decision to metric matrix, which can effectively evaluate impact of these decisions on the key areas and key KPIs of organization or government actors. I think that's it from my side, and Evgen, you can continue to the next slide.
Yeah, thanks very much, Maxime. So we're going to move on now to go over a couple of the examples, some of the simulations that we run. And with that, I'll hand it over to Alex to introduce this topic.
Thanks, Eugene. Really appreciate that. So This is where the simulation experience kind of where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. With this is where we develop actual scenarios that allow both policy or state, university level players to participate in a decision-making process from a country perspective. And we also have teams or individuals playing the role of companies in a specific industry that shows how these geopolitical events will not only affect at the country level, but also at the individual company level. So one of the recent simulations that we ran had to do with a flare-up in conflict between the US, China, and Taiwan. And basically the gist that we set up, the scenario that we created to run the simulation was focused on a period in late 2025. I believe the month was December. We had a spike in tensions between the People's Republic of China and the US over a variety of issues, including trade, technology, and certainly the issue of Taiwan. So very real, very relevant to the current environment and very timely. The scenario basically laid out in the terms of where the negotiations broke down between the US and China. In response to that breakdown, and maybe parallel to that, the Taiwanese president announced that there was a new US supplied weapons package deal that was reached with the US, which of course was deemed unacceptable by Beijing, who vowed very strong repercussions to that development. The next phase was the Chinese Communist Party announced a new clean energy law aimed specifically at Taiwan, which was basically targeting the inflows of energy supplies into Taiwan and the requirement that any oil or natural gas or coal shipments to the island had to first make a stop at a Chinese mainland port for inspection. But of course, it was designed to manipulate the flow of energy into Taiwan, which, you know, the Taiwanese are extremely dependent on imports of energy, specifically to fuel their very energy hungry semiconductor production sector. And so in response to that, the largest semiconductor supplier, TSMC, privately contacted manufacturers around the world, including in the US and Europe and Japan and Australia. And they started to warn of potential shortfalls in semiconductor delivery if this law was to hold. So this is the scenario that we created to facilitate the next steps of the simulation, which involved decision-making responses from both the country level players and company level players. Next slide, please, Eugene. So one of the really interesting things that we track, as Maxime mentioned, is the difference in response from a human perspective versus the AI perspective. And so when we ran this simulation previously, one of the responses that we saw in the economic/hybrid policy realm was that US and Australia, this is coming from the human decision-making perspective, decided that they were going to reduce their tech and LNG exports to China by 50%. And the players acting on behalf of Taiwan and Japan decided that they were going to be reducing tech exports to China by 10%. In response to these actions, the team playing China countered by first reducing critical minerals export by 10% specifically to the US, and then they escalated that response to 50% export controls to all countries, but also showing some willingness to negotiate in accepting talks at a summit with the US. Now, this was really actually quite different than what we saw unfold in the AI response to the simulation. In the AI response, the Indo-Pacific countries deepened ties with each other. So it was more looking as like a coming together, particularly of regional allies, while the US and Australia only proposed instead of implementing 10% trade reductions in the tech and LNG. This was the round one of the simulation. So the initial response that the AI took was a bit softer, a bit more nuanced, and a bit more aimed at negotiation than what was seen from the human players. In the second round, the AI actually did go escalate that to 10% restrictions against China. And the US proposed a summit in round one and proposed an easing of trade restrictions in round two, indicating a strong willingness to de-escalate. So we see in this particular example at the country level that human decision making tends to be a lot more emotion driven. It has the capacity to be more volatile, more reactive and aggressive in its response, whereas AI is a little bit more of a calculated risk. And at least in this example, the AI option for response was more muted relative to what we saw from the human players. Next slide, please. We also had the players make some decisions in both the security and intelligence policy realm, as well as in the diplomatic and political policy realm. And I don't want to read all the text here, but you can certainly look through the bullet points. But basically, the key message that we saw come out of the simulation at the policy level, at the state level, was that the participants avoided a major conflict and prevented China from taking the action of actually going through with the implementation of this extremely restrictive green energy law. But there was, what we saw, a significant disruption, at least in the near term, of supply chains, most notably semiconductors and critical minerals. Next slide, please. And so given that dynamic, that even when we have a low escalatory scenario, it still causes, at least for a period of time, a significant disruption in supply chains, a significant increase in uncertainty and volatility, we then went on to ask the question, how does this affect individual companies active in a specific industry that would be impacted by these developments? And in order to ascertain the impact on those companies, and Maxime touched on this earlier, we developed a matrix of decision making that focuses on key performance characteristics that the management teams of those companies are looking to maximize or to at least achieve specific outcomes with, which include financial things like revenue, profit margin, cash flow, currency sensitivity. They include operational elements like productivity and capacity utilization, but also supply chain resilience. They include customer and market-oriented considerations, things like market share changes, the churn rate of clientele, revenue concentration risk, and the impact of those developments potentially on a company's brand or reputation. And then we go further to think about what does the longevity, the business continuity of a company look like in that set of developments. And so we actually look at organizational health and talent elements, including retention and turnover of employees, the productivity per employee, and then change in fatigue and change in leadership that could potentially result of these developments. But at the core of it, we also consider the strategic and risk implications, things like the geographic footprint of the business, regulatory compliance, geopolitical risk exposure, and increasingly important, the cyber risk exposure. As we saw very recently, the web cloud, the Amazon Web Services and the Google Cloud that recently had huge disruptions were extremely disruptive to the business continuity perspective. And so we try to ask questions around how does the geopolitical environment affect those things as well. Next, please, Eugene. And so in order to facilitate the perspective or run through a hypothetical scenario, from a company perspective, we actually develop fictitious company actors. In this case, for this simulation, we ran with a company called Electromechanical Systems. Again, this is not a real business, but it does have the characteristics of a real business. As you can see, it's a US-based electronics manufacturer, active in the semiconductor supply chain. The firm had annual sales of about $30 million and employed 100 people in 2024. And it sources raw materials and component inputs from several international locations, including many in the region that was affected by this geopolitical simulation, places like China, Japan, South Korea, and so on. Please continue, Eugene. So what we really try to assess is the impact of the unfolding scenario at the country level. We actually monitor the way that countries respond and then ask the question of how does this affect the company's operation on the ground day to day. And so we saw that a spike in the Indo-Pacific geopolitical tension, it disrupted this particular company's supply chain stability and caused shortages in key inputs, which led to growing lead times and slipping project timelines, and basically made some of their customers very unhappy that the company could not deliver. Even though customers understood that this had nothing to do with the company itself, there was still a lot of issues and a lot of disruption resulting from these developments on the relationship that the company had both with its supply chain partners and its customers. And the company now had to make real world critical decisions regarding the supply chain. So we actually put a decision vector in front of the company players and asked them to pick a specific set of actions. Next slide, please, Eugene. In this case, what we were focused on is the supply chain action menu. Now, we actually gave them 4 or 5 different decisions to make. I'm just using this as an example. And the options that we presented them with is to maintain sourcing as it was without any kind of drastic moves in the short term, because they thought that the disruption was going to be temporary. The second option was to develop more domestic sources, try to find sourcing that is not vulnerable to this geopolitical environment. They could have shifted either 50% or 100% of their sourcing to another location somewhere around the world, or implement a multiple sourcing location scenario. We typically talk about this as a China +1 type of scenario, which means that you have still continued relationship with Chinese suppliers, but also some in Southeast Asia, some potentially in Eastern Europe or Latin America. But basically, it's a diversification strategy. And in response, we asked both human players and AI to make these decisions. And what we found was the decisions were actually quite interestingly different in this case. So please bring up both next steps, Eugene. So you can see that the human players on the left here, they decided to develop domestic sources further. And always when asking players to make a decision, we always try to seek an understanding of what's driving their decision making. So we asked them to provide the reasons or the rationale behind why they chose this. The human beings in this case said that the developing more domestic sources enhances supply chain stability, reduces exposure to geopolitical risks, and mitigates the impact of any future tariffs. The AI player chose to implement multiple sourcing locations. So one of the things that we recognize here is that the AI, while being able to analyze a lot more information than a human being could, it also sees things in a little bit more of a black and white nature. So it went immediately to what I would call the most aggressive option, because it viewed the risk to the supply chain as extremely disruptive to the business and immediately wanted to fix it long term. So it implemented multiple sourcing locations, and the reason given was that these locations would reduce future exposure to a single choke point and mitigate disruption from political escalation or maritime interference, as we saw unfold in this scenario. So it's a really interesting perspective into how the human brain considers certain nuanced things like the timing element of a particular disruption, whereas the AI considers different things and tries to solve for problems in a very different manner than human beings do. Next one, please, Eugene. So we also ran a second scenario focused on the Middle East. And I think that this is really interesting because whereas the China-Taiwan scenario really impacted things like semiconductor supply chains that are very specific to a particular industry, the Middle East actually had a much broader implication in terms of the kind of disruptive forces that it unleashed. So in this scenario, which also happened to be in December of this year, Israel-Iran tension intensified due to a resumption in Iranian nuclear activity. Iran threatened to disrupt the Strait of Hormuz, which is obviously a vital energy choke point. So basically the threat here was we're going to cut off global oil supplies to a significant extent, causing energy prices to spike. In response to this, Israel engaged in a military operation that targeted Iranian HVTs, or high-value targets, such as military leaders and nuclear scientists. The follow through from the Iran-backed Houthis of Yemen. They started to contemplate and even threaten to disrupt shipping in the Red Sea by once again increasing the number of missiles that they launch and drones that they launch at cargo ships. And then the response from the US was to threaten secondary tariffs against Iran's oil exports, specifically to China. And I think here the thinking was that perhaps China can be leveraged to influence Iran's behavior because they don't want to see a decline in their own oil supplies. So this was once again the scenario that we laid out. The policy developments, we again ran a couple of different rounds here. From a country level perspective, what we saw the actors do is Israelis decided to strike an Iranian oil pipeline, causing their oil exports to go down substantially. The US did follow through on imposing secondary tariffs against both the Chinese, Indian, and Russian personnel, companies, and networks that facilitate Iranian oil exports, which caused further pressure on Iran. And then finally, the Houthis in Yemen did follow through and launch attacks on a European oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, causing Saudi, UAE, and Qatari oil gas exports to go down by 10%, because obviously they don't want to put more of their supplies under threat of, explosion as a result of being attacked by drones or rockets. We also saw significant implications at the company level. So the so what from the geopolitical developments to a firm, we always try to put ourselves into mindset of the key decision makers at that organization. What they saw as a result of this was a major increase in oil prices, which increased their own energy, gasoline, and shipping costs. The timeline effect in terms of shipping their products through Middle East channels declined. That means that it took longer, and that further increased company shipping costs and times, as you can see, by double digits. Material and component availability for this particular company actor decreased 10% as a result of the decline in global trade, and the company's ability to deliver their finished products to international customers also declined substantially due to this disruptive force. Next slide, please, Eugene. In the second round, the US tried to de-escalate. They removed the secondary tariffs on Iran oil exports. And again, these are human beings making decisions as to what a country level actor would do. So there was some negotiations. And as a result of those successful negotiations between the US, China, and Iran, we did see a de-escalation. China did pivot to make up for the 10% shortfall of its own energy supplies, particularly oil, through increased imports from Russia. The Gulf states did redirect supplies to make up for the 10% reduction, and diplomacy did bring energy supplies back to normal after a period of time, minus the specific reduction in Iran's oil exports. So the implications of the second round of decision making at the policy level was that oil prices did retreat 8%, easing the pressure on the bottom line of the organization. And as global trade flows normalized, we also saw the ability to both source components and materials and deliver final end products to customers improve dramatically after a brief period of time. Next slide, please, Eugene. So in this case, the company actor that we used was called Precision Products, Inc. This was a contract manufacturer headquartered in Long Island, New York. This was a larger company actor, revenue of 200 million and 350 employees last year. Please continue, Eugene. The impact of the scenario on this particular company, of course, the spike in oil prices increased their shipping and operational costs and had a negative impact on demand, which it actually caused some demand destruction to occur, which affected the company's business in the near term. The reduction in global trade made it very difficult for this business to source materials and components, and the company had to make critical decisions regarding its prices and inventory levels. So if we can go to the next example, please, Eugene. In the case of the pricing options, we basically gave the human players and the AI an option to either keep prices stable in the near term. If they wanted to increase prices, they could do that through the second option, which only increased those prices for tier 2 and below clients, meaning they insulated the core customer base and only increased prices for those ordering one-offs or low volume orders or highly customized product. They could have implemented temporary surcharges for all clients or could do a price increase or decrease across the board. If we can bring up both decision makers, please. On the human side, what we saw was a more nuanced response. They decided to increase prices only for tier two and below clients. And the reasoning given was that they wanted to protect important customer relationships, maintain competitiveness in core accounts, and but still try to attempt to recover some of the rising costs through accounts deemed less critical to the organization's future success. The AI chose to implement a temporary surcharge for all, and the reason was cost exposure is due to volatility of the environment, not a continuous or steady shift. The surcharges allowed for passing through the fuel and premium and freight premiums transparently, and it could be rolled back quickly if the situation stabilizes. So in this particular case, I think the AI had a bigger perspective. It realized that on a temporary surcharge basis, like a line item on the invoice, something that's easier to take off. Once you increase prices for those tier two and below clients, you're not likely to go back and decrease those prices after the environment stabilizes. So the AI in this particular case chose to take a little bit more of a temporary approach. Next slide, please, and go ahead and bring up the two decisions also. The last option that we posed was an inventory action option. They could have kept their inventory levels unchanged, decreased them or increased them, or shifted to just-in-time production, basically being very reactive to producing products as orders come in. In this example, we actually saw the human players and the AI player make the same decision. They both chose to increase inventory level by 10%, but even then, the rationale was somewhat different. The human players increased inventory levels because it offered flexibility without significantly impacting cash flow or operations and presented a limited risk. The AI went into a little bit more specifics. So it said it does buffer near-term shipping delays without overcommitting a working capital, which the human players also recognized. But this particular decision was backed up by a more targeted approach, with the AI deciding to focus on single source long lead products specifically tied to the Middle East and Asia shipping lanes, which is a really interesting dynamic that we didn't see emerge in the human decision-making element. So next slide, please, Eugene. And I believe this is it for me, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Alex. So I think you guys can see that we explore a lot of different dynamics here in our geopolitical simulations, not only looking at geopolitical crises, whether it's around US and China over Taiwan, or a flare-up or kind of an intensification of Middle East conflicts, but really focusing on the implications, the real world, so what, as Alex mentioned, both from a policy standpoint, and by policy, I'm talking about everything from, actual state actors, but also, humanitarian organizations, other NGOs that are dependent on international lines of supply, as well as business actors, whether you're talking about small, medium, large-sized companies. So I wanted to kind of close out here, and we will leave a few minutes here for Q&A by just letting everybody know that we have recently launched an early adopter process for our geopolitical forecasting platform. So basically the backdrop on which we conduct those simulations, but also a regularly updated version of the platform, which allows users to basically maintain situational awareness, tie those geopolitical, incidents and developments to very functional things like trade impacts. And no less importantly, to have always a forward-looking element, whether through our forecast reports or the interactive exercises on the simulations that we just went over. So we have been doing these simulations for quite some time, and we can customize those to the audience's needs. But this early adopter process is for the launch of our geopolitical forecasting platform as a regularly updated service. And right now we're offering it free of charge for select early adopters. So if you can check out this QR code, pretty easy to sign up for it. And all that we ask in exchange is regular feedback from our users, because we're always looking to iterate and basically enhance the experience. Other than that, just some upcoming events that we have related to the platform and to our simulations is that on a weekly basis, that global forecasting platform that I just mentioned, we update that every single week with new curated and real-time incident feeds. as well as a forecast monitor that we publish at the end of each week on Friday. So if you're signed up for this early adopter, for the geopolitical forecasting platform, you will be getting new updates every single week. On a monthly basis, we do, this webinar, which we're currently in. Last month, we did a broader introduction of the geopolitical forecasting platform. This time, we're focusing more on our simulations, obviously, and we will be focusing and featuring various features of the platform every single month. So our next webinar will be in mid-December, and more information to come on that. And then kind of on a quarterly basis, we also update the trade flows in that interactive trade feed that Maxime had shown, as well as we produce quarterly and annual forecast reports across all those geopolitical hotspots. And then just kind of briefly rounding it out on the simulations front. So we explored some of the simulations that we run on a regular basis, both at the human and AI level on US, China, as well as the Middle East. But we've also been developing and executing different simulations around, for example, climate and extreme weather disruption, both in the US and globally. And we're working right now to finalize a longer term forecast for the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which actually shows the conflict basically, in a period of 3 years, and this ties into our longer term forecasting, kind of spreading and transforming into other areas, including the Arctic region. So these are simulations that we'll be doing on a regular basis, and hopefully you all can be a part of those as well. With that, I'll wrap up and kind of open it up for any Q&A, and just kind of noted our ways to contact us, our various emails for myself, Maxime, and Alex. And yeah, I will wrap up there.
Eugene, it does look like we have a question come in from Rain. Curious to hear about where the scenarios typically run and how organizations control their enterprise data as part of input data.
Great. Yeah, very good question. So in terms of where the scenarios typically run, if I understood the question correctly, so we are basically able to run these simulations both, in an in-person, a virtual, or a hybrid format. So we have conducted simulations, for as small as a group of, 5 to 10 people, and as many as several hundred people. So obviously the level of virtual versus in-person participation will vary, and that obviously depends on the audience as well, whether it's in a university environment, a business environment, or a policy environment. And how organizations control their enterprise data as part of input data, that's a great question as well. And perhaps Maxime and Alex, if you guys want to weigh in on this particular question.
Yeah, so I can take this question. Like first of all, it's we provide all the security. It means that we do like a data isolation, right? And this data can be stored in the infrastructure of enterprise and private cloud, and in specific like region or of the cloud, and so on. That's the first. The second, enterprise can control what kind of data to provide, and what's the level of security of this data. And it depends like how operationally we need to go, right? So if the simulation more like on macro level, on strategic level, there is not a lot of data needed from the enterprise. But if we go just more like a operational level, so more data is needed, but definitely we can do it step by step and fully control the security policy and data isolation for this specific like private data.
And I'll add to that when we do a specific simulation with a customer, we don't do it in the general platform. We create a unique instance of the platform where that can be supplemented with the customer's specific data. There are also certainly the ability to sign NDAs and other ways of making sure that the data is protected, but it doesn't get fed into the main platform. It gets fed into an instance of the platform that is unique to that particular customer. And that's one of the ways that we aim to protect their data as well.
Great. Thank you both. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. And one I'm seeing is the question of, can other commodities and specific product categories be added to the trade flow visualization component, which I think kind of ties to what we were just talking about. And the answer is absolutely yes. So We didn't have time to do kind of a full platform demo, a live demo, because we covered that primarily in our first webinar. And like I said, we're happy to share if you guys write to us, with any interest, we're happy to share that as well. You can also find that on our YouTube channel for New Lines Institute as well as Mantis Analytics. But yes, what Maxime kind of showed was just, for brevity's sake, a total trade category, but we're able to kind of break that down. So for example, in the trade categories that we've used for that US China Taiwan simulation, that includes everything from energy supplies like natural gas and coal to critical minerals like gallium, germanium, lithium, etc., and as well as advanced technology exports that Taiwan, US, and other countries like Japan, Netherlands, etc., export. And so these are things like semiconductor devices, advanced integrated circuits, all of the elements that can be that would be very important in the event of that scenario. In the Middle East case, we're looking at things like overall oil, shipments and even regional shipping through choke points like the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea. But that can be broken down into as specific detail, including proprietary company data as possible. Basically, it's all meant to be as relevant and actionable to the users, whether we're talking about from a simulation standpoint or just a general platform use as possible.
And Eugene, I'll just add to that that we look for partnerships in designing these simulations. So the company that works with us has the ability to specify what kind of outcome they're looking to achieve, and we will do our best to accommodate their requests and the desired objectives into the simulation experience. And it's that partnership between the what we do and the company's goals that really creates a successful simulation platform.
Great. Thanks, Alex. So I think we've got just a couple more minutes, so I'm happy to wrap up. I just wanted to thank, first of all, my co-panelists, Maxime and Alex, and I wanted to thank you all for joining and for asking questions. Feel free to reach out to us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thanks all.